What you're about to hear is the second part of our interview with Mr. Yves Engler. If you missed the first part, you can go back using our channels, and we'll see you here back shortly.
But yeah, I mean, that's a conversation for another day. So now let's move on to Israel-Palestine, which is all the rage. And actually, I want to start by talking a little bit about how the media has really reported on it, because that's something that's been very prominent when in Western, like especially English language media, when it comes to covering the Israel-Palestine conflict. So in foreign policy, usually when they've called the last like few years, I guess, like a frozen conflict. But anyone who's been on the ground or known about it knows that it's anything but a frozen conflict. The Israel and Palestine conflict I'm talking about. But the media, when reporting on it during the recent, whether we want to talk about the Israeli police invading Al-Aqsa Mosque or the Hamas rockets falling on Israeli cities, the media has portrayed it as like clashes, war, flare-ups. Like the wording has been very, like that, basically, like showing that it was like a war, But if you look at the death toll of any like Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's like 35-1. For every 30-ish Palestinians killed, there's one Israeli killed. So can you explain like why does the media report it like that?
Well, the simple explanation is that Israel is aligned and close to the U.S.-led empire, and the rules of the dominant media is that when it's countries that are allied with us or us doing it, the violence or human rights violations are downplayed, and when it's countries that are in the crosshairs of Washington or Ottawa, the human rights violations are well documented and often exaggerated. In the case of Israel-Palestine more specifically, it's Canada has been totally tied into Zionism for a century, right? There were Canadians who helped conquer Palestine in 1917 for the British. There were Canadians Canada played a very important role in the creation of Israel in 1947 with the UN partition plan at the UN, which was highly, highly unjust for Palestinians. And there were Canadians who fought in 1947-48 to establish Israel and ethnically cleanse it of 700,000 plus Palestinians. And right up until today, you have a government that is enabling Israeli apartheid in so many different ways in the Trudeau government, and so you have little appetite for criticism in the dominant media. You also have a very effective pro-Israel lobby that pushes back on the media, right? You have Honest Reporting Canada, which is the best known of them, which is just basically a FLAC organization. It for anti-Palestinian FLAC organization, where any time that any Canadian media outlet publishes something that's sort of truthful about Palestinian dispossession or isn't completely subservient to the Israeli perspective, Honest Reporting Canada does one of their alerts, and they get people to email the media outlet, and they put in a formal complaint, and they basically try to make life hell for the reporters or the editors that covered the issue in a way that they didn't like, and that contributes to the anti-Palestinian perspective in the dominant media. I mentioned. Concordia, when Netanyahu was brought to Concordia, he was brought in by the Asper Foundation. Well, Izzy Asper owned the Montreal Gazette, the Ottawa Citizen, the National Post. I think it was about 12 different papers across the country. And Izzy Asper was open. I mean, he was a very aggressive anti-Palestinian. He passed away, and the company no longer owns those news outlets. But he was very aggressive. They instituted a policy of writing editorials from the head office in Winnipeg when they bought up Can West. And one of the editorials actually prompted the editor or the head of the Montreal Gazette to quit because the head office in Winnipeg was forcing this like hard line anti-Palestinian perspective onto the Montreal Gazette. There was instances, these were documented at the time, I talk about them in my book, A Propaganda System, how Canada's government, corporations, and media sell war and exploitation. And there was wire copy from Reuters. So Reuters is a British news agency, and there's wire copy stories written by reporters on the ground in Israel or in the West Bank, and they rewrote the wire copy to like make it anti-Palestinian, right? So they just changed words, right? The journalists on the ground talked about clashes between, but I don't know, I can't remember the exact words in front of me, but clashes between Israeli forces and rebels. And then they instead of putting in rebels, they put in terrorists, or right. They just just changed the wire copy to make it even more anti-Palestinian. And they got caught doing that a number of times, to the point where Reuters was complaining, because Reuters is saying, hey, you're basically just, you're lying. You're changing our story, but you're still putting Reuters as the source of the story. And that's distorting, what actually happened. So, it plays out. There's all kinds of, specific elements. Yeah, when you have pro-Israel FLAC organization pressuring media, that has an effect. When there was this period of time when one of the leading news conglomerates in the country was owned by the Aspers, who were known for being, incredibly anti-Palestinian. Well, that has a whole effect. More general, just the broader political culture has an effect. The fact that the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, the main pro-Israel lobby group, B'nai B'rith, Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center, the fact that they have, over 100 employees at those organizations, where the pro-Palestinian organizations in the country have maybe, 4 or 5 employees. Well, that has an effect, right? These are cumulative. They play out within the political culture in general. They play out within the media. So a combination of Israel being a close ally, that Canada has enabled its dispossession of Palestinians for more than a century. That combined with Israel being close with the American empire, combined with the fact that you have this pro-Israel lobby that's well organized, and also has this powerful tool of playing victim. Right, labeling anyone who criticizes Israel as being anti-Semitic. So you have a situation where you have a well-organized pro-Israel lobby. You have many of these figures, people like Aspers, the people who set up the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, like Heather Reisman and Jerry Schwartz, the Tannenbaum family. These are billionaires, but they're simultaneously playing victim. Right, that it's like this is all this criticism of Israel is just because you don't like Jewish people. So you have a mix of alignment with empire, Canada being deeply complicit, well-organized Israel lobby, and the ability to label, opponents of Israeli policy as being motivated by, anti-Jewish animus. That combined puts a lot of pressure on the media to follow a pro-Israel perspective.
Yeah, I'm actually a little bit interested about what you just said about anti-Semitism, right? I mean, I'm sure that a lot of figures who are, Zionist or otherwise would call you yourself anti-Semitic, right, for opposing.
They've been doing it for 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, obviously, yeah. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of people would say you yourself are anti-Semitic, but the question I want to ask is because. As someone who has taken in college has had to take classes on gender studies and learn about intersectionality, the left has been aspiring that, using that term and aspiring to it, saying that how your class, sexuality, your different identities intersect, and they basically multiply your oppression into orders of magnitude, right? But it seems that anti-Semitism falls into this really gray area where when someone calls the word, you yourself have said that the word anti-Semitism in an article you wrote for the Rabble, I think you said that it's overused. But do you think that there is place that for someone being Jewish can be victimized for being a Jew?
Oh, for sure. I mean, probably the worst concentrated victimization of any people in the history of humanity was, the Nazi Holocaust and that was, wasn't only Jewish people that were victimized, but they were the far and away the worst victim. So for sure, and today there are instances where, I mean, what happened in Pittsburgh a few years ago, where the synagogue people got killed there and stuff. I mean, it's a clear example. I don't believe that from a structural standpoint, the Jewish community is a victim of it's not an oppressed community. I don't believe that. I think that the hate crimes, Jews are victims of hate crimes far out of proportion with their proportion of the Canadian population. That's clear. It's exaggerated. What B'nai B'rith tells us and what gets reported on in the dominant media is exaggerated from the reality. But the reality is clear that Jewish people are substantially overrepresented in hate crimes and stuff like that. When you look at most other socioeconomic indicators, the ones we discuss on most issues, whether it being increased incarceration, whether it be income level, whether it be positions on the corporate boards, right? You'll find that on most of the 20 main criteria that we usually use in sociological affairs, you'll find that generally, Black people, Indigenous people, they're overrepresented in jail, lower incomes, on, be many different of those indicators that they are on the kind of lower rung of. That's not the case with the Jewish community, right? The only commonly used indicator that the Jewish community, and I say that with a little bit of hesitancy because I haven't looked at every single indicator, but this is somewhat superficial, but the main indicator that Jews would be overrepresented is with regards to hate crimes, not necessarily for education levels, income levels, higher rates of imprisonment, et cetera, et cetera. So and these things become like difficult kind of questions to deal with because you can't really talk about this stuff honestly, right? Like, when the pro-Israel groups are accusing, McGill of being anti-Semitic, right? Because there's like some pro-Palestinian resolutions that have been passed by the student union. When there's this whole kind of like push against all these claims being made of anti-Semitism, if you come back and you say, well, you know what? No, the truth is that the Jewish community is not underrepresented at McGill. If anything, the Jewish community is probably overrepresented at McGill. When you come back and you sort of look at these issues in a statistical kind of way or in a dispassionate way, that's viewed as anti-Semitism, right? They view that as in itself a form of anti-Semitism. So it's they're difficult discussions, and you're seeing it. We're seeing it right now in terms of a really concrete. I mean, there's this violence taking place against Palestinians in Gaza, which is a violence on top of decades and decades of structural violence and other massacres and whatnot of Palestinians, long-standing occupation, dispossession of Palestinians. Well, there's this outpouring of pro-Palestinian sympathy on Canadian streets. Well, what's the response been from the pro-Israel groups? The response been is to basically say that anti-Semitism is on the rise. And from their logic, I mean, I think much of what they're doing is just completely disingenuous. But from their logic, some of it's not actually totally disingenuous. If you believe that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, then it's true. I mean, anti-Semitism is on the rise, right? When there's 5,000 people marching in Montreal against what Israel is doing, that's just like 5,000 people, engaging in anti-Semitism. So that level, there's a sort of coherence to that logic. But more generally, I think that what's going on is just a very disingenuous. We can't defend what Israel's doing, right? It's hard to defend. But anyone who really starts looking at it closely, it's clear that Palestinians are oppressed and Israel is the oppressor. And so what we want to do is we want to change the channel. And how we change the channel is by saying, there was some car on May 15th, there was some car that went into Côte Saint-Luc and they had a Palestinian flag and they apparently were yelling at Jews. And they, this is a sign of, anti-Semitism taking over, and the Jewish community is all feared. And the mayor of Côte Saint-Luc, actually made a robocall according to the one report in Canadian Jewish News I saw, made a robocall to every resident of Côte Saint-Luc to basically say, are you concerned? Don't be concerned. Oh, apparently there was an Israeli flag. One of the public institutions in Côte Saint-Luc had an Israeli flag, and somebody, I guess, climbed up and ripped the Israeli flag. That's considered one of the big instances of anti-Semitism in Côte Saint-Luc in recent times. And so they did this robocall to all the people in the municipality, and just trying to generate this whole discussion, this whole kind of feeling that this upsurge in pro-Palestinian activism is either designed to or just is anti-Jewish. So the question of anti-Semitism has become a really important one. And actually, to go even one step further with that, what happened with Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, right, where Jeremy Corbyn, left-wing politicians, kind of his leadership of the Labour Party in Britain, it was in large part sabotaged by these allegations, erroneous allegations of him being anti-Jewish. And it's become a tool to attack the left more generally, right? It's become a way of dividing, demoralizing, weakening the left. Partly because the left is pro-Palestinian, but I think also partly just sort of there's a more general dynamic playing out. So the whole question of how to deal with the allegations of anti-Semitism and stuff like that has become quite an important one to deal with, and a very difficult one to have honest and fruitful conversations about.
Yeah, usually a lot of the conversation on this topic is around like whether you think that Israel should even exist or not. And as someone who lives in I live in Unsik, right, where there's a very large Lebanese community. I went to high school with almost 2/3, I would say, of the student population was Arab, mostly from Lebanon and Syria, right? And I have to say that anti-Jewish sentiment was generally generalized, generalized in that specific community, to the extent that in the school it was like totally fine to, for example, say that if you saw a Jew you would kill them, or say that, or call people who are cheap a Jew, using Jewish as a slur, right? Obviously there was whenever there would be the conflict would heat up in Israel-Palestine, you had, Arabs are very nationalist people. You had people with their Algerian flags or Lebanese flags or Assyrian flags marching in the hallway, chanting Harir Palestine, it was Min al-Nar il-Albar, which means free Palestine from the river to the sea, right? And that's often something that is very commonly used by Palestinian, pro-Palestine activists who are Arabic, Min al-Nar il-Albar, which means, from the river to the sea. I actually want to ask you, as a very prominent pro-Palestinian activist, do you believe that Israel has a right to exist?
Well, the first thing I just want to respond to, I think that's abhorrent that people either use Jew as a euphemism for cheap, or that to kill Jewish or whatever. I presume that the people were doing it as it's abhorrent in and of itself, but hope some context on that, who are figuring things out for themselves, and wasn't their
right. But for just some context, is because the Lebanese community, as I said, most of the children weren't born or ever lived in Lebanon, is because in 1982, Israel, the IDF invaded Lebanon to fight against Hezbollah and other organizations and the PLO camps that were there. Hezbollah was in 2006. In 1982, that was the PLO, and they invaded Lebanon. And a lot of I know a lot of friends who equally Christians and Muslims, doesn't matter. They were even Druze people. They were either killed, tortured, or otherwise they were victimized by the IDF and the Israeli soldiers. And the parents teach the children to hate. And the children they proliferate that, and when you're in an environment like in my high school where that ideology is generalized, then it becomes okay to say those kind of things, is what I was saying.
Yeah.
And back to what I was asking you. Do you believe that Israel has right to exist?
I don't even know what that means exactly. Does Canada have a right to exist? Do I believe, did South Africa, apartheid regime, have a right to exist? I don't know. No, I don't believe that a state based upon special rights for that structurally, institutionally, legally marginalizes the indigenous population that has a right. I don't personally. I try to do everything I can to get out of some of these debates about one state, two state. What I focus on is how Canada has contributed to Palestinian dispossession, how to resolve the conflict. Like there's never going to be proper justice, just like there's never going to be proper justice to First Nations here. There, a whole process of colonialism that we can lessen how much we continue it, and we can do some things to redress the historic injustices. Obviously, to say that all Jews in Israel, or that they should go back to Europe, that's just an injustice on top of an injustice. In a similar way to saying all non-Indigenous people in Canada should go back to wherever they came from. But no, I think that the racist nature of the Israeli state doesn't have a right to exist. Now, are there ways of keeping Israel as some form of safe haven for Jewish people around the world while allowing Palestinians to return, right? The Palestinians who have the keys to their homes from 1948. Yeah, I think there is a way of doing that. I think there are ways of maintaining things like if not the law of return that allows Jewish people from anywhere in the world to go to Israel, but that provides some form of that, continue some form of that in terms of Israel as being a potential safe haven, and simultaneously redresses the profound injustices to Palestinians. But I don't think that states in general don't really have a right to exist or not to exist.
Mr. Engler, I wanted to talk about a bit more on Canada's involvement in supporting the Israel racist regime, as we're talking about. So you were talking about how Israel could act as a safe haven for Jewish people around the world if they wanted to go to Israel. However, right now what we see is Canada supporting Israel in terms of arms. It's also supporting some sort of almost colonization of Palestinian lands through organizations such as Charities. So can you explain a bit how does media cover up of the fact that Canadian is supporting Israel's regime, and how does Canadian organization actually support the regime itself?
Yeah, current Canadian government supports Israel in innumerable different ways. 2 weeks ago, it pulled out of a global conference against UN conference against racism because previous conferences had criticized Zionism. It's voted against more than 50 resolutions of the UN upholding Palestinian rights. It has a free trade agreement with Israel that includes products produced in the occupied West Bank, as allows them to come into Canada as if they're just products of Israel. There's some military sales. There's also Canadian military buying weapon systems from Israeli companies. There's a whole research industrial fund between Canada and Israel, funded by the Canadian government, that subsidizes relationships between arms companies from the two different countries. The list goes on and on about different ways in which Canada supports Israel. A couple of the important ones that I think don't get enough attention, and just kind of point to how extreme that support is the foreign enlistment. So there are Canadians who get recruited to go into the Israeli military. Now that Canada has something called the Foreign Enlistment Act, which makes it illegal to recruit Canadians for another country's military, since 1947 that has never been applied with regards to recruiting for the Israeli military. But to the point where the groups like Federation CJA, Federation Combined Jewish Appeal, which is the main Jewish umbrella organization in Montreal, and United Jewish Appeal of Toronto, back in June of last year, they were promoting a webinar, which was titled Joining the IDF. And it was very explicit that the event was about how to join the IDF. Again, we have a law on the book that says it's illegal to recruit Canadians for a foreign military. Similarly, the Israeli consulate in Toronto has been openly recruiting for the Israeli military. And then there's also, you get into this different, like at the level of like schools. There's like Jewish schools here in Montreal, Hebrew Academy that does a whole bunch of things that looks like it's trying to induce students to join the Israeli military, and then Tannenbaum Chat and others schools in Toronto. So that's an area, and from a media standpoint, so I've been involved in the campaign since October, actually before that, where we launched a campaign against IDF recruitment in Canada with a formal complaint, like a legal complaint with evidence submitted to the Justice Minister, and a public letter signed by a number of prominent individuals like Noam Chomsky, Roger Waters. And we've done a whole series of action alerts. We had this public letter, created this legal submission, and we shopped it around to different journalists to try to offer them a first go at writing a story about it. It was a fascinating experience because it was about like 6 or 7 journalists from the CBC, from Canadian Press, who were interested, expressed some level of interest in covering it, and then never covered it. So they would say, "Oh yeah, this is interesting. Maybe and then I got to check it out with my editors. I got to see what's possible." And then they consistently came back. Ultimately, we actually waited a couple of weeks to publish this public letter because we were shipping it around to different journalists. Ultimately, Le Devoir actually published it, and actually published it on the front page. But it took going through a whole bunch of different journalists, and of course, Le Devoir is it's in French. It's much less influential on this issue, especially than CBC or Toronto Star or Globe and Mail. And since October, when we published it, Le Devoir did another story the next day after publishing the front page, and then a couple months later, the Journal de Montréal did a story about our campaign. But we've had a whole series of different initiatives. The most recent thing right now is there's a parliamentary petition that's been signed by more than 7,000 people against Israeli military recruitment in Canada. And anyway, so we've done a whole bunch of different things, and we've put out 6 or 7 different press releases on this campaign, and total silence. So we've published, it's probably like 30 articles published in left media outlets like Rabble, Electronic Intifada, Palestine Chronicle, Ricochet, Canadian Dimension. So it's been widely covered in pro-Palestinian and left-wing Canadian media. But the English language dominant media in the country, just complete silence. And we've tried at it from so many different angles to try to get them to go with the story, and they just total refusal to cover. Another issue that's somewhat related is the whole question of charities, and I believe that's the most important Canadian support for Israel. More than $250 million raised by registered Canadian charities for projects in Israel. And registered charities, of course, can provide tax receipts. So that means that the Canadian taxpayer is covering a proportion of those donations. 30-40% of the funds is subsidized by the Canadian government. So that means that something in the range of $70, $80, $100 million a year would be potentially covered by Canadian taxpayers for these donations. And they go to all kinds of different projects in Israel. There's, in and of itself, it doesn't really make sense that Israel now has a GDP almost equivalent to Canada's GDP. So why is Canada providing subsidies? It's not, this isn't a poor country, right? Why are we providing subsidies for aid projects in Israel? Why, we're not doing that with Sweden or Japan or France, or in very, very limited amount. But then if you dig deeper, you find out that a whole bunch of these charities that are supporting projects in Israel, they're actually supporting the Israeli military. That's explicitly contrary to charitable law. The the Canada Revenue Agency says you cannot support another country's military, but a whole bunch of the projects support either directly or indirectly the Israeli military. Additionally, they support projects that are in the West Bank that are basically supporting Israeli settlements. That, according to this, is a little bit of a contested area, a bit more contested than the military one. But the position of the Canadian government ostensibly is that Charities should not be supporting projects that are supporting settlements in the West Bank, because the Canadian government officially doesn't believe that that's legal and that those are illegal settlements. And so any charity supporting projects in the West Bank should lose its charitable status. Yet there's a whole bunch of them that we know, like the Friends of Ariel University. Ariel University is a university in the settlement of Ariel, which is widely very controversial. It's supporting the settlement university in the West Bank. So all those groups shouldn't have their charitable status. Additionally, Canada Revenue Agency says it promotes anti-racism. Well, there's groups like the Jewish National Fund that's an explicitly racist organization that doesn't allow non-Jews to use its property and excludes Palestinian citizens of Israel. So if you start looking at some of these charities, you find that I think a lot of them are either explicitly, certainly implicitly, but even explicitly racist. So they shouldn't have their charitable status for that reason alone. So if you were to do a proper audit of the more than $250 million being raised for Israel-focused charities, I think you'd find that a lot of them today contravene Canada Revenue Agency guidelines. So they should be losing their charitable status, or putting another way, what they're doing is illegal. It's contrary to registered charity laws. So this is a whole question that's completely off of the radar. The dominant media does not discuss this whatsoever, about how much money is being raised, how that's being used, how it could, it in many cases explicitly and implicitly contravenes charitable guidelines.
Right. And actually, I want to ask a question about Human Rights Watch. Okay, so Human Rights Watch recently, said, well, not recently, but the Human Rights Watch found that Israel's conduct, its policies and actions towards the Palestinian population, the West Bank and Gaza, have met the definition of apartheid and persecution. As I said, there's this view, this diverging view between the Zionists and those who are pro-Palestinian. So the pro-Palestinian activists view Israel essentially as like a extension of settler colonialism in the Middle East, right? As this like Western implant, as you mentioned Nasser earlier, he viewed it like that. Meanwhile, those who are Zionists say that no, we are indigenous to that land. We are indigenous to the lands of Judea and Samaria, and we are returning to our rightful land, right? Furthermore, Canada and several other countries like Japan and the US have designated Hamas, which is the elected government of the Gaza Strip, as a terrorist organization. So with all that in mind, as Stephen A. Cook points out, for example, who was on the Council of Foreign Relations, what is Israel supposed to do? Like, how is Israel supposed to defend itself and how is Canada supposed to act if essentially as far as Canada is concerned, Israel is opposed to a terrorist organization in the Gaza Strip?
You pointed out that earlier on that the numbers, it's 20, 30, 10, what it is exactly, I guess about 240 to 12, I think it was. So 21, 22, 23 times more people killed by the IDF than than Hamas. And IDF is not on the Canadian terrorist list. I think the whole Canadian terrorist list, that's one of the ways in which Canada enables the dispossession of Palestinians, is by criminalizing much of Palestinian political life, so that it's totally incongruent to have Hamas on the terrorist list and not have the IDF. And it's not just Hamas; it's Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. I think there's 8 or 9 Palestinian groups that are on Canada's terrorist list, and the pro-Israel lobby is trying to add new ones constantly. They would like it to be that it's just all of Palestinian political life is illegal to have for Canadians to have any contact. So that's part of changing Canada's pro-Israel policy, is to change those dynamics. Now, in terms of Israel, Israel has, before Hamas existed, Israel was dispossessing Palestinians. Before Hamas existed, Israel was killing Palestinians. I'm an atheist. Hamas is not, it's not the political ideology that that I espouse, but when you're occupying the West Bank, when you're controlling the air and the sea and getting in and out of Gaza, that Hamas resists in whatever way Hamas resists in. When there was March of Return protests where people were, peacefully marching towards the prison gates of Gaza, whatever that was, a year, I guess 2 years ago or so, Israeli snipers were just, taking out from afar, were just taking out the legs of medics, including a Canadian medic, and, killing many and destroying the lives of many, many more. What are Palestinians supposed to do? What they just accept the fact that they're caged in Gaza and that's just their lot and nothing can be done? I mean, that doesn't, human beings don't tend to accept that forever. So, firing rockets across, residential areas of Israel, do I like that? No, I don't think. I don't think anybody who has a humanist impulse likes the idea of rockets being fired in residential areas. But what do you do, right? Like, Israel has, look at simple statistics, right? Israel's GDP is around 40,000 plus. Gaza is like $900. It's like 40, 50 times higher. Israel is a nuclear armed country with this massive high tech weaponry. We're talking about like pretty basic rockets from Gaza. Israel can just phone in to buildings in Gaza and say, okay, you got an hour and then we're going to blow your whole building up. The imbalance of power is just so out of proportion. And, most people who live in Gaza were driven from their home in 1948, right? Most of them are refugees from current day Israel. And, it's, So no, I don't. I think Israel needs to end the siege of Gaza. Israel needs to end its occupation of West Bank. Israel needs to offer some form of redress for the Palestinian refugees. That's what Israel needs to do. It needs to, stop and stop killing and stop its oppression.
Actually, about concerning Hamas, right? So Hamas, as it is, it's like a double-edged sword in terms of it's how it faces Israel. It's a more aggressive organization compared to the Palestinian Authority, which people see as basically like an extension of Israel. So Hamas is kind of seen as like this defender of Palestinians, and as Palestinians, they elected Hamas to the government. But at the same time, what I've really been had trouble reckoning with is like here in the West. I'm not talking about liberals, but like the genuine left, like those who are, just call themselves socialists, have, sided with the Palestinian side. Hamas is an Islamic fundamentalist Sunni organization. How does that work? Like how can you like reckon? Like how does the ideological reckoning work? Like being like on the same side as like a fundamentalist Sunni organization.
Yeah, like I said, I'm an atheist, right? But Hamas is also why Palestinians voted for Hamas. I think is in large part because it provided some form greater resistance than the Palestinian Authority that was subcontractor of Israel's occupation. So I don't think that opposing what Israel's doing in Gaza means promoting Hamas. I don't think that's what that means at all. I think Hamas is a legitimate actor. I don't think Hamas should be on Canada's terrorist list. I think that's outrageous. If you're going to have Hamas on the terrorist list, then you definitely need to have the IDF on the terrorist list because it's contributed way more killing than Hamas has. But I can wish that Palestinian resistance was all done in the way that fit my preferred public relations perspective from sitting here in Montreal. But what does that? That doesn't mean anything, Like there's a reality that people in Gaza live and experience and influenced by, and all kinds of things that Hamas is of that. For a long period, Israel enabled Hamas, or because it saw strengthening Hamas as a way to weaken the secular Arab nationalism of the PLO, right? So it was sort of, allowed Hamas to establish itself. And even today, right? Like, Netanyahu is kind of almost in some form of indirect alliance with Hamas, where it serves his purposes to be able to demonize Hamas and say the bad Hamas. So he doesn't want to completely crush them in Gaza, but keep them kind of weak. Don't let them get strong enough to be really any threat. So that's, I think, part of the political dynamic playing out there. But I think those things are all secondary to the broader issue of if fundamentally this is a European colonial project that needs to be stopped, and it needs to be, like I said, again, there's never going to be some full justice, because to try to get some full justice to Palestinians would create another injustice. But you can greatly you can stop the thrust of the injustice and provide some form of redress for the historical injustice.
Yeah, and as a last question, I mean, since we're coming to the end now, let's talk. You talked about NATO a lot during this interview, so let's talk about potentially adding Israel to NATO. So, in a special report by the NATO Association of Canada, Israel is considered as a potential member for NATO, and in the past, Israel and NATO have had close cooperation, such as opening a liaison office in NATO's headquarters in Brussels in 2016, and the ongoing Israel participation in NATO military exercises. Do keep in mind that recently, one of the big accomplishments before Trump left office of foreign policy has been the Abraham Accords, right? Where several Arab countries, Gulf monarchies, and Egypt has already had normalized relations with Israel. But, Sudan and Saudi Arabia, they all normalized their relations with Israel and opened diplomatic ties. So what do you think this tightening relationship between Israel and NATO means for the Middle East, and how will this relationship impact the relationship between Israel and other Middle Eastern countries and Palestine?
Yeah, I would be a little surprised if Israel was to formally join NATO. But I mean, I think it's bad for Palestinians. It's reflective of Israel strengthening its hand. Israel is a hub of high-tech weaponry, right? So a lot of NATO countries and a lot of countries outside of NATO want to. Part of the reason why they've developed better relations with Israel is because they can purchase drones and other weaponry from Israel that they see as helpful, useful. So the military component, Israel promotes its weaponry, right? It's like it's field tested, right? They get to every couple of years they get to test these things out on Palestinians in Gaza or the West Bank. And that's good from a marketing standpoint for weaponry. It's good to be able to claim that and to show that and how the weaponry has been employed. But yeah, I mean, I think at one point Canada was actually the contact point between Israel and NATO. I'm not sure if that's still the case. But yeah, I mean, I think NATO, there's a more general question about NATO, which is that NATO shouldn't, Canada should be withdrawing from NATO, and the whole expansion of NATO is a negative development. And, it's just a club of militarist US-led club that is, its supposed justification of the Cold War with the Soviet Union is, long past, and NATO just keeps getting more and more significant and important, which I think tells us a lot about what NATO was, always about. But yeah, certainly Israel joining NATO would be a step in the direction of strengthening the sort of militarist outpost that Israel represents.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That was a really long and very fruitful interview. And it was great being your host for today. Well, I guess co-host, but Henry Lee was on the sidelines.
Yeah, we're like the main host.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming on the Henry Lee Show today. Well, actually, on a more, let's say on a casual fashion, aside from the 11 books you wrote, which will be in the description, I mean, they're very big brain reads, so make sure that you're prepared to read them, because they're quite a read, all of them. But do you have any other books that you want to recommend to our audience?
Oh, just books in general.
Yeah, like what's your bookshelf look like, actually?
Well, I don't have that much of a bookshelf because I mostly take the books from the library. But I mean, there's a new book called Canada in the World by Tyler Shipley that just came out. Good book to look at. On foreignpolicy.ca, which is the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute's website, we have a whole list of the best books on Canadian foreign policy. There's probably 25, 30 books there. So people can check that out at foreignpolicy.ca on around Canadian foreign policy. So.
All right. Well, thank you. That was very, very nice having you. And we hope to see your continued work. And when is your next book? When is your next book coming out? If you want to do a little plug here.
Yeah, it's called Stand on Guard for Whom? A People's History of the Canadian Military. And it's should be out in about 6 weeks.
All right. I'm a sucker for books. I might pre-order it. So.
Thank you everyone for tuning in to listen. I hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we did during the interview.
If you liked this episode, learned something, or just want to help out a bunch of students, please leave a review, write a comment, and share this on social media. If you are listening to this on YouTube, please subscribe and write to us in the comments.
All the books and other resources recommended by the interviewee are in the podcast description/video description depending on your platform, and depending on when you see this, you might be able to use our affiliate link to purchase them.
The Marianopolis Addendum podcast is actively seeking local sponsors here in Montreal, so if you are interested, please contact us at the email linked in the description. All the profit generated by this podcast will go back to fund our club's activity. If we have any surplus, they will be donated at the end of every month to a local charity. This episode was edited by Min, and the artwork is done by Camilla Huang.
The producers and guests associated with this episode may express their opinion, but this podcast does not support any political parties. We only aim to bring different perspectives on different issues through the free exchange of opinions and ideas.
We look forward to seeing you at our next broadcast. Cheers!